Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tours and beyond the headlines. Crowded dinghies in the English Channel, refugees walking thousands of miles to an uncertain future, and more recently, clashes on the border between Belarus and Poland. Over the past decade, migrants have dominated our news headlines, prompting promises from politicians, with the enormous exception of Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel, to keep them out. Our next guest says, for the most part, the debate about migration is a sham. It's politicians and not the migrants who are the source of the problem. He's Andrew Connelly, and he's currently speaking to us from Turkey, home, incidentally, to some 3.7 million refugees. Hello and welcome, Andrew.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
It's great to have you with us. It's going to be a fascinating hour ahead. Just to start with, just say a little about yourself. You write for a number of papers, including Foreign Policy magazine. You also do radio as well. Just give us an idea of what you do. And I'm really used to travel around the world following the story.
Yeah, it's a lot of migration reporting for the last few years. I would say for the last 5 or 6 years. About displaced people, about refugees, about also border policy and asylum policy. And this is largely from the route known more or less as the Balkan route, from Turkey to Greece, up the Balkans through to Northern Europe, but also the Central Mediterranean route, which is people largely coming from sub-Saharan Africa all the way through to Libya and then Italy and so on. And also I do, when I'm back in the UK, do stuff related to sort of similar things about minorities, but also Brexit, Scottish independence, Northern Ireland, and also occasionally forays into, say, the South Caucasus, like Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think the migration as a topic is certainly not new, but I think our awareness of it has obviously been brought around significantly since about 2015, and we're going to talk about that in why that's a huge movement has come about, perhaps for obvious reasons, but we're going to sort of delve into that and the policy responses to it. But to start with, I just want to look at one example, and that's really here in the UK. And now our newspapers are really covered by images of people crammed into dinghies, into rubber dinghies, and in some cases, very sadly, those dinghies really not making it, and people drowning in the English Channel. This phenomenon only started in 2018. Can you just say how that came about? I mean, was it just a case of someone got the idea, right, this hasn't been tried before, so we're going to start trying out this route? Give us some of the context, and then I want to, you mentioned that word Brexit. I want to know how that has changed the response to migration within the UK. But let's just stop the very simple question: why do people start going across in dinghies?
One simple answer you could say is it's a classic example of when you block one particular route of irregular migration, another one opens up. So the traditional, well, it's true to say that a lot of people enter the British asylum system once they're already in the UK under some sort of a legitimate visa, or sometimes maybe illegitimate visa, but that's one route. But people traditionally would get be a stowaway on a lorry or a ferry, say, but over the years the British government have spent tens of millions of pounds basically in France, if you've ever driven through Calais, you will have seen sort of vast barbed wire fences, and they've also invested in things like sort of heartbeat monitors, CO2 detectors, even financing sort of divisions of French riot police who destroy various sort of informal camps that migrants make in France. So a lot of that has been done, and by the Home Office's own admission, drove people to the beaches. So of course COVID-19 did halt a lot of the kind of traditional traffic going from France to the UK, where migrants might sort of jump on board too. So that has affected things slightly. But
this really sort of comes back. I mean, I think Theresa May talked about creating a hostile environment for immigrants. And so it goes back to that. So basically you're saying is, I mean, partly the French don't want the refugees to stay, or migrants to stay within France. So they make it very difficult for them, dismantling the camps, and that UK policy has made it really very difficult for any other, whether you're hiding in a lorry, those other avenues have been cut down. And so it's really sort of out of desperation, or the people smugglers have moved to that route as a result.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about smuggling is that it is actually a very sophisticated and adaptive business. It can be done with large volumes of people along a very long coastline. And it's true, of course, that in one way the French say, well, these people are going to the UK. They're not actually deciding to reside in France. So in one way, this is not our problem. Although, of course, there is cooperation between the British and the French do, though not always, but they do intercept boats in French waters and take people back, and sometimes on the beaches. That is true. But again, it's an example of how policy can actually stimulate the smuggling market and raise the prices, and therefore also increase the risk for those that are embarking on those journeys.
Let's stay with this example for a bit, because I think this is fascinating. The UK has declared, and also you'll see in newspapers here, that there's a migrant crisis. And you'll see, whether it's the Daily Mail, Telegraph, you'll see pictures of the, refugees coming on the dinghies, and it's a very prominent political issue. Yet the thing that's really sort of quite ironic is that immigration was really at the core of that Brexit debate. And the promise was, I guess, was we're going to take back control, and we're going to be able to take back control of our borders and take back control of migration. So there's, to me at least, there seems some kind of, what's going on there. So post-Brexit, what system have we created, and what controls are in place, and what's changed? And this is quite a big topic, but I think it's important to unpick.
Well, I think sometimes it's overstated how much of a difference there is now post-Brexit. I mean, I think a lot of the arguments made during the Brexit campaign about immigration largely related to, the sort of automatic right of any EU citizen to live and work in the UK, and it often really centered on certain countries of the EU. Often the poorest ones, like Romania and Bulgaria and so on.
Yeah, so conceptually that stopped. They no longer have the right to be here, and obviously with COVID, many of them have gone home. So that, that's clear.
Yeah, and the sort of irony was that the UK did have automatic opt-outs that it had sort of, successfully gained over the years as it's very powerful member of the EU. For example, in 2015 and 2016, when thousands of migrants per day were landing on the beaches of Italy and Greece, the EU adopted a kind of internal relocation mechanism to relieve the burden on the southern states, so that some of these people, if they were eligible, could be relocated to different countries around the EU. Now, the UK had an automatic opt-out of that. It never decided to opt in, so it never had to sort of express this solidarity there. One thing that the UK was party to was the Dublin system. In a nutshell, it means that if you are an asylum seeker entering the EU, the first country that you are registered in, you're fingerprinted under a database. So often this was Greece, Italy, Spain, because they're the frontline countries, Bulgaria also. If you then went to another country and you were then sort of found by the authorities and fingerprinted, that country had technically the right to send you back to the country that was responsible for your original asylum claim. Now, ironically, the UK didn't actually use that very much when it was an EU member. There was a big spike of returns just right before the very end of its EU membership, to make some sort of political point about. But actually, ironically, when the UK had access to this system, it mainly was receiving people through that mechanism, because what that did was also the ability to reunite families. So if one family member that was a refugee in the UK had one in the EU, they could be reunited. So actually, ironically, the UK did actually take in more asylum seekers under the Dublin system than it's sent out. But the point remains that if you're registered in France, fingerprinted in France, and you go to the UK can no longer automatically send you back to France to be registered. They don't have that right anymore.
Okay, so because you've lost that cooperation, you can't actually send back the refugees that you might have done, or the migrants you might have done before.
Which the government may wish it could do now.
Right. Okay, that's fascinating. There's one more thing I want to. What's the policy now if you are trying to? What is the penalty for you if you travel on that dinghy across the channel, as opposed to going through official channels? What's the position of the British government now when it comes to refugee status within the UK, or migrant status in the UK?
I think the first important thing to say is that there are almost no such things as official channels, really. The legal avenues are extremely slim to none. I mean, even, for example, it's 6 months on from the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, and the sort of much publicized Afghan resettlement scheme for some, including people that have worked with British forces and so on, people that are really at high risk. Only about, I think it's one person has been relocated to the UK using that. There are really very few schemes. Many of them have been shut. For example, there was a scheme to take unaccompanied minors from Calais to the UK. And it was cut after barely reaching half of its target. I think it was barely 1,000 people or so. So the plans that are sort of working its way, it's a new immigration plan that's working its way through the House of Lords. For example, it basically draws distinctions between those who use the official routes and those who come irregularly. And basically, for those who come irregularly, the prospects aren't good, because effectively the government wants to invalidate your asylum claim. This goes contrary to the Geneva Conventions, which say that refugees shouldn't be punished for the manner in which they come, or indeed the fact that they may have passed through other countries on the way that are deemed safe. I mean, the fact is that if you don't speak French, if you don't have any family members or community or connections in France, the chances are you just simply won't go there, and you may speak English too, which is the fact for many of them. So they go to the UK, and what the UK is trying to do is say that you won't really receive full asylum status. You may well stay in the country because it might be impossible to deport you, but you will have a kind of sort of diluted status that will be reviewed constantly. You, as asylum seekers, for example, right now and for many years, you won't be allowed to work. From my perspective, this will basically increase the amount of, people living in the shadows, people having to resort to black market labor and
let me just counter that, because if I take the position that I don't want migrants coming from Afghanistan or Africa or whatever, and I support the government's line. I want a hostile environment for immigrants coming. I don't want we've had good enough people in the country as it is. This is an effective policy. Okay, the fact that some people are choosing to get in dinghies and cross the channel, that's tragic, but they've taken it on themselves to do that. That's not our responsibility. And in the meantime, we have this policy is effective. And you saying it's not, these people are still coming, but they're just going underground.
Yeah, I mean, also, a lot of these policies are based on, I think, a fallacy, which is, so it's deterrence. It's the idea that if you create, say, a hostile environment, first of all, that migrants on the way to the UK have any understanding about these intricate asylum legislations that you're introducing, and most often than not, that is not true. People don't really understand what's facing them there, legally speaking.
It's not a complex assessment of the refugee or migrant policy in the UK. Is I want to go to Britain because I've either got family there or because it's Britain.
Yes, I mean that's largely it, and then of course what governments, not just British, many of them practice this, is that they hope these harsh deterrent measures will somehow the message will be sent back that someone will be put in a sort of crumbling barracks full of sort of COVID positive people in the South Coast, and then they'll phone their parents in Kabul and say, oh, it's pretty rough here, better not come. This simply doesn't matter, because if you've made it that far, and if you have come from a place of great upheaval, that you may be detained for a while in bad conditions. Well, the idea that it's simply better than what you came from, which is most people move. And I think most importantly is to say that you can't, this is not a phenomenon that ends, and this is not something that you can magically just wish away. People will, even if you drained the water in the channel, people will find a way to reach the country. And I think the choice, like there is a choice. You can make that manageable, and you can make it humane. But actually, you cannot simply just stop it by waving a magic wand. It won't work.
I was deliberately sticking with the UK because it was just one example, and I think Brexit's been a key part of it, and that's why there's been so much focus here politically about it. But if we stand back a bit, migration, immigration, refugees are not new. If you take the UK, for example, we've had waves of immigration in the 60s, and then there have been reactions to that. We've saw, with the European Union, not in terms of migrants, in terms of refugees, but we had the internal market. So there've been sort of ups and downs in this. But what's happened since 2015? Can you remind us? We saw millions of refugees coming from Syria, coming from the Middle East, coming from North Africa. What was, just to rehash that, what is behind this big drive now? Because it's undoubtedly increased over the last decade.
I think sort of 2015 was largely the product of sort of various overlapping crises. I think the Syrian conflict has to be number one. Though it started in 2011, of course. I mean, I would say the game changer in Syria was, well, the lack of Western intervention in the same way as say Iraq, and then the intervention of Russia, who supported the air force of Assad to bomb civilian housing from the sky, and then scatter refugees in their sort of hundreds of thousands. And you also had at the same time ISIS occupying large parts of Iraq and Syria, and then the ongoing sort of calamity in Afghanistan. And those were the three main nationalities entering Europe during those years. But actually, a lot of those people who I met on the road, I mean, many of them had actually come very, very recently from sort of the war zones I just mentioned, but some of them had also attempted to stay in the region, so in Jordan, in Turkey, in Lebanon, and Egypt, and so on. But they found the conditions there just intolerable. They weren't allowed to work. They were subject to a massive discrimination. They couldn't put their kids in school. All the basic, the access to healthcare was non-existent, and that is also the kind of push factor that leads you to leave. And then although the boats going from Turkey to Greece, I mean, it's not a new thing. I mean, Kurds, for example, were going that way in the early 2000s, fleeing Iraq. But I mean, it just built up into this critical mass. Also, by the way, I mean, there have been for a while land controls, like sort of on the Greece-Turkey border for obvious reasons. These are two countries that are not on good terms. So actually, again, that's another example of how one border was already blocked, and the one where you had about a mile or even less distance between the Turkish mainland and a Greek island, that became very, very viable. And basically, over 1 million came. Mainly they went to Germany and went to Sweden and so on. And in the years since, we saw, well, obviously a lot of border control taking place in Europe. Fences have gone up, lots of borders have been militarized, deals have been done. For example, the EU famously made an arrangement with Turkey to say that in exchange for several billion euros, we will give this to you to first of all house, the refugees that you are hosting in Syria. I mean, Turkey hosts the most refugees in the world, mainly from Syria, but also very much part of the deal was that you stop these boats from leaving. And not only that, but the ones that we deem to be, to have non-meritorious asylum claims, you will take them back as well. And then there was also a part where for every sort of refugee that you accept back, we will relocate one to Europe. And the last 2 points of those deals never really happened. Turkey never really accepted any refugees back. About 2,000 refugees were accepted back. Then, of course, you have the coup here and lots of issues between Brussels and Ankara.
But if you were going to take, if you as a European policymaker, you might say, well, look, listen, it's worked. We don't have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of refugees coming through the Balkans anymore. Yes, there is a trickle, But generally it works. But what's your assessment of that? And then maybe perhaps we can talk about Belarus.
Yeah, well, yes, it's certainly true that you have nowhere near the kind of numbers we're talking about from 2015, 2016. That's true. But what you do have is a lot of underground movements. I mean, in 2015 and 2016, you could see it. And you could try and register it, but now it still goes on, but it happens in the darkness, and it's very hard to assess actually how many people are entering and in which way, and also routes change. I mean, over Christmas there were 3 capsizing of boats in the Aegean Sea, and they were not going the normal route of reaching the nearest island from Turkey. They were actually trying to reach much further ones, and this is because of the pushback policy that Greece has in place. So again, this is a factor of closing one route.
But isn't that a success in terms of, if your electorate unhappy with foreigners coming in, they're hidden, so it's not a problem?
I mean, to a certain degree, I've been on the Greek islands like really recently, some of them, and yes, okay, that you don't have these sprawling ghettos anymore. You have sort of financed by EU money. They're sort of good, but much better conditions. They are actually sort of more prison-like, though. I mean, the entry and exit is very much controlled. They could well turn into sort of just simple detention facilities. But the problem is, if these people are deemed unworthy of asylum, and Turkey doesn't want to reaccept them, what do you do? I mean, you need to actually build bigger and bigger jails for these people. The second point is, of course, Turkey increasingly, like any other country, doesn't exactly appreciate being the warehouse of refugees for Europe. And, there is a growing nationalist sentiment here. Syrians have been attacked. Quite a lot of political parties here rage against them every day. And and then, of course, you have places like Lebanon, which are extremely fragile places for the Lebanese themselves, let alone the Syrians, the Palestinians, and so on. So it could be like a temporary fix to say, oh yeah, they've stopped now. But if you kettle them in quite volatile places, sooner or later you're going to have a problem.
Yeah, some people say that the Lebanese civil war in the mid-70s is essentially prompted by the exodus of Palestinians, first from 67 to Jordan, then from Jordan to Lebanon in 72. So I do see where you're coming from. And Lebanese do have a particular concern or paranoia about the presence of over 1.5 million Syrian refugees there at the moment. What happened with Belarus?
Belarus is an interesting case. So in a nutshell, it is a bit complex, but in a nutshell, ever since the disputed elections, the other year in 2000 in last year, the dictator who's been in power in Belarus ever since independence, so about sort of 27 odd years, Alexander Lukashenko. So he's just become increasingly more tyrannical and brutal. So he lost the election. He proceeded, and there were mass demonstrations. He sent his riot police in to beat everyone up in jail and torture them. For which he received sanctions from the EU. He doubled down on this famously by, there was a dissident that had escaped Belarus and was resident in Lithuania, who got on a plane from Athens going to Lithuania. It flew over Belarusian airspace. Lukashenko instructed his air traffic control to ground that plane based on a fictitious bomb threat. And then he proceeded to take this dissident and his girlfriend off. So this is an act of air piracy on a European airliner going from 2 European capitals. More sanctions followed against the regime. And as a result, Lukashenko decided to strike back against Europe. And the way he did so is instructing his intelligence agents, which are still called the KGB, first to go to Iraq. And they would basically collaborate with local smugglers and sort of travel agents there. And what they would do, they would basically convince Iraqis, many of them Kurdish Iraqis, and say, look, for about sort of $5,000 or $10,000, we give you this package. You fly direct from Baghdad or Sulaymaniyah or Erbil to Minsk Airport, the capital of Belarus. Once you're there on a plane, no boats involved. Once you're there, you get visa on arrival. You exit the airport of Minsk. You're picked up by sort of, a wise guy in a van. You're taken to a hotel for a night or two in Minsk. Then you get a call. You go out. You're driven to the border of, in the beginning, it was Lithuania. Belarus shares a border with 3 EU states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. and basically they take you to the border, the Belarusian border guards there, and go, there you go, there's Germany. And this is what was happening. And it created, for example, I think the year before last, Lithuania received 80 asylum seekers using that route from Belarus, and last year it received over 5,000. Then also Lithuania hosts a lot of Belarusian opposition, so that was another reason why Belarus wanted to lash out. But the main flashpoint occurred in Poland, where all of these sort of thousands of refugees who were able to actually get on planes, not just in Iraq, but then, using the state Syrian airline, they were able to fly from Damascus to Minsk. Lots of people were able to fly from different countries in Africa and transit via Istanbul airport and go to Minsk. And therefore you had, over 10,000 people on the border of the eastern border of the EU trying to get in. And the Polish obviously responded, by flooding the zone with troops and barbed wire, and skirmishes occurred. The EU did a lot of diplomacy, for example, with Iraq, and basically getting Iraqi airlines to shut down that route, and including with other airlines. So basically, for a series of nationalities like Syrian, Somali, and so on, they are not allowed to get on planes going to Minsk anymore. So it's sort of died down in terms of not many people are entering Minsk using that route, but the conditions for the people getting through to Poland were really grim, because basically there's a gigantic forest in the middle. People were going through sub-zero temperatures, and if they were caught by the authorities in Poland, they were returned right back to the border, and then the Belarusian border guards would push them right back into Poland. So there was a very grim game of human ping pong going on, which to a small degree still is.
I'd love to get people's questions. Do start writing your questions in the Q&A box. There's a lot more here we can discuss, but I'd love to bring questions from people wherever you are. What is the argument of the refugee organizations, NGOs? I've talked loosely about why, from the electorate's point of view, from people who oppose immigration, you've got to keep people out, and these are popular policies. But you're saying is these deaths on the Channel, people freezing to death in the woods, families being separated, basically the human misery and suffering that it causes doesn't have to be there. You're saying that a more sensible migration policy could be in place. But my reaction to that would be, well, surely tens of thousands of people are going to come. What do they say? What do they say in terms of what could be done?
Well, I mean,
we're talking really about the EU here. We could be talking about the UK too.
Yeah, I mean, there are some sort of 80 odd million people displaced around the world. So in fact, the amount of people that do arrive in the wealth, let's say the global north, the wealthy countries, Europe and North America and Australia and so on, comparable to the problem, is very small. Now, of course, some people might argue it's too many as it is, but you sort of have to understand that something like 87% of refugees do literally cross the border that's next to them, and that's where they stay. That's why you have Somalis in Kenya for several generations. Normally, that is what people do, and actually,
if they want to go back home, ultimately.
Look, I mean, this is my experience talking to everyone. Most people obviously don't want to leave, forever. Often people do want to maybe leave for a bit and then come back. This is why, for example, you have interesting ideas regarding the US, for example, where you have Central American migrants largely trying to get to the US. There are, for example, projects where they're like seasonal agricultural visas. Canada, for example, I think accepts something like 10,000 Guatemalans every year. They're able to go to Guatemala for some months, work in farms there, then they return home, and the money they make there enables them to have a kind of prosperous life and send their kids to school and get the healthcare that they need and so on. Now, I think the US in turn takes about 4,000 Guatemalans on similar schemes, despite having an infinitely larger economy. And that is a solution for a lot of people, not everyone, of course, because then if you're from, say, like a country like Honduras, you're living in an effective war zone. I mean, it's gang ridden largely, by the way, driven by the drug consumption of North America and so on. So actually those people, for example, need kind of humanitarian protection because it's very dangerous for them to return. They can't just sort of work for a bit and come back. So there's different needs there. And I argue that part of the problem is, yes, it's true. I mean, I don't really like this word economic migrant, but it's certainly true that people can arrive in Europe and of course they may be like a young guy from West Africa or Bangladesh who simply wants to provide for their family. They don't have a persecution threat, which is what the protection system is for. But because the system is dysfunctional and because there is simply just a lack of legal avenues for people to work and study in the West, these people enter the asylum system, you know, and I would argue basically one solution to that is to drastically widen the legal avenues for people to come and go. Okay.
So just to come back at that the equation is roughly this: the global north is prosperous, and it's somewhere where people are going to want to go, conflict or no conflict, whether you're a refugee or not. It's attractive or somewhere to go. But by and large, these are aging populations, and they don't really want their society to change that much, and they don't want foreigners that much. Yet, I guess economists would say, in actual fact, these economies need migrants. They need the human capital in order to grow. What contribution do refugees make or migrants make once they are generally in? I mean, have there studies that been done that show their contribution? Are they a drain? Are they net contributors? How does that work?
I think the answer to that lies in the apparatus that's available for refugees in whatever country they end up in. I mean, at the end of the day, it's true that if you are an elderly man, or a sort of not even elderly, but in your 50s, but you're from a sort of a war-stricken rural part of Syria, and you may be illiterate, and then you manage to get to Germany, yeah, the chances are that maybe you won't actually manage to get a job, and you might just sort of need the protection afforded to you by Germany, and you may not be so useful for that country. But if you're coming with your children who are young, who are able to pick up the language very quickly, as has been, it's a mixed picture, but in Germany, certainly, way more than a third, even like getting up to 2/3 of Syrians between I think the ages of 18 and 40 have gone into either education or training or employment, in the last sort of 5 years, which is not a bad outcome, in that short space of time. For example, Venezuela is one of the biggest refugee crises in the world. Colombia, which neighbors Venezuela, recently decided to give a 10-year legal status to the Venezuelans who are there, some more than 1 million of them, so that they can, work legally, they can access healthcare and education. Now, it's a big ask, and it needs a lot more funding from the world. It's an extremely underfunded refugee crisis, and of course, in some ways, it's a bit easier because there's a common language. There's actually a very common history. The Colombians were the ones going to Venezuela back in the day when they were riven by war and so on. So there's a debt that they feel they're also paying to the Venezuelans. But it can be done, and I don't say it's easy at all. But at the end of the day, like some people, we have to talk about mental health. If we're talking about war refugees, or even, for example, people who transit through a country like Libya. They didn't come from a war zone, but they transited through a war zone. I've met many people who are held hostage in Libya and kidnapped and sort of tortured for money. They become quite traumatized by the very journey that they're making to the EU, and so a huge amount of focus needs to be done on the mental health of these people, because if that's in a bad state, they'll be not fit for working or anything. So it does depend on the commitment that countries make on integrating people. So in my experience, if you're given the chance of being able to stay, in a way that your status is guaranteed and you won't be sort of, reviewed every year and possibly kicked out, I think actually you do flourish. I mean, you have to. Most people just don't want to sit around, and the kind of welfare that people do get as an asylum seeker is often massively exaggerated by people. It's often, not enough really to live on. Most people don't want to do that.
Okay, Venezuela is always Colombia strikes me in contrast to Lebanon. Lebanon, The refugees don't have the right to work. So if you're a Syrian refugee, just as Palestinians beforehand don't have the right to enter the economy, and so they're marginalized permanently, and the sort of long-term implications of that are quite frightening. Andrew, by and large, we've been talking about that, the North-South issue, the idea of Western nations, or I think including Australasia and the Europe, United States, North America. But there are, as you say, conflicts taking place throughout the world, and in many cases people are displaced and they don't have any intention of going to Europe. Can we talk about Nagorno-Karabakh? Because I know you've done some reporting there, the recent conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and huge numbers of Armenians, the Azeris won the war, and huge numbers of Armenians displaced from that area. What are the chances of those people? I know there have been attempts for some of those to go back to their homes. It's an example of a conflict, I think, where there's no, it's a very good example of the conflict where people have been displaced and their future is uncertain.
It's also an example of a conflict that sort of took the world by surprise, because at the time that it happened, which was a bit over a year ago, at the end of September last year, it was, again, the first year of the pandemic. It was also the US elections. So the world was really not looking. And that was arguably one of the reasons that Azerbaijan decided to launch the attack. And basically, what you had there was an extremely mountainous territory. It's been administered by ethnic Armenians as a de facto independent state since the 90s, since the last conflict in the 90s. It's a big dispute about whose land it is. I mean, there are Armenian churches there for millennia and so on, but the fact remains that for the last since the 90s, it's been an ethnic Armenian run territory, but Azerbaijan has a claim on it. And also when the Armenians won the original war in the 90s, not only did they maintain the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, they actually sort of secured a whole buffer zone around the area, some of which was actually populated mainly by Azerbaijanis. And in the space of 44 days, largely with the help of Turkish drones with missiles, Azerbaijan took this territory. And what was extraordinary to see was that, this was not a war that where you saw any sort of massive, agencies, aid agencies involved. You would see basically piles of clothes and food parcels all over the capital, Yerevan, heading up to be given to people in Karabakh, or for the refugees that had come down from Karabakh. It was really a kind of sort of civilian run effort. People that with a spare room in Armenia would host someone from Karabakh. And it's sad, because obviously some of these Armenians simply don't have may have a home that is now literally behind enemy lines. It's now run properly by Azerbaijan, and they won't be able to go back. And Armenia is an extremely poor country. It's it really has no natural resources of any kind. What it does have is remittances of people who are mainly sort of working in Moscow, in Russia and so on.
I was struck by something in your reporting of that, and I've seen this elsewhere, that people do take refugees into their home, their compatriots, but after a while, that sense of hospitality, you might have children, filling the schools, that sense of hospitality can wear thin, and that can creep into resentment.
Sure. I mean,
the school psychologist was one example that I picked up on you met.
Yeah, sure. And that's just natural. I mean, I guess everyone would like to think.
Can you just mention that example, so that for those who haven't read it?
Well, I mean, for example, some of these people I'd met had just, a few days before seen a rocket fly into the windows of their neighbor's house, and they had seen their neighbors dead. And that's not the kind of thing you forget ever. And the level of trauma. So yes, of course, you need somewhere immediately to be. But of course, that's not sustainable. I mean, if you're in a house with a spare room, you'll put up someone for a bit, but at the end of the day, you have to get on with your life. And actually, that's not how It should be, like like refugees, internally displaced people obviously need their own place to live, their own sort of life to pick up. You can't just expect human kindness to last forever. I mean, even the most sort of well-meaning people, can't put up with that long term. So what you need is sort of mechanisms for people to be able to, in the short term, just have a roof over their head, but like for protracted kind of crises like we see around the world, obviously it requires a significant amount of investment. Otherwise you will just have migration flows going out of the country. You'll have sort of destitute people on the streets. And indeed, if we're talking about sort of, again, asylum seekers not being allowed to sort of enter the asylum system, they are prey to traffickers, to drug dealers, to criminals. Again, I mean, for the Armenian context, it was obviously a little bit different because these are ethnic, there's ethnic kinship there. It's not, I mean, although don't get me wrong, I mean, there's a bit of a difference between someone living high up in Nagorno-Karabakh to someone living in Yerevan, but there's so many similarities there.
Yeah, the example I was thinking was there was a school psychologist, and there's a mother who's brought her child to school, and the school psychologist turns around to the mother and says, our sons died for you, do not spend one more day here, you need to get back to Karabakh and defend our soul, but we've lost our blood for you, what the hell are you doing?
Sorry, yes, no, I remember this I was quite struck by that, because actually the propaganda at the time of that conflict was that Armenia is winning the war. I mean, it was everywhere that you saw. Even if you got out banknotes from the cash machine, like the cash machine was saying, "We will win." Like the propaganda was everywhere, and it really actually contradicted the reports coming from the ground that actually the Azerbaijanis are encroaching. There's like running gun battles, in the streets. I mean, this area is being taken over very fast, and Armenia is losing a lot. And so when it came to like the end of the war, people were extremely traumatized and annoyed, and therefore there was a bit of resentment towards because every single person that you met either had a son, a brother, a father, a cousin that headed to the front line in a matter of days.
It's a small nation, and everyone's going to know everybody
exactly
else.
So some of them actually responded not with empathy but with outright hostility, saying we died for your territory that we don't care about. Not all of them were that sort of support.
In a moment, Andrew, I'm going to ask you about what drew you to this work, and talk a bit about how you do it, because it's a challenging job, a heart-wrenching one too, but also very interesting at times as well. Diane Cook, we've got a question from you. Go ahead, Diane.
Sorry, done the wrong button. Andrew, sorry, this is UK-centric again, I'm afraid, but when you have a government policy that is to create a hostile environment to bring as few people as possible, but of course people still get through and they still keep coming, and then you basically say, well, you've got to live in detention centres, you can't work, you can't do this, that and the other. And the numbers keep going up. What do you see the next step in those type of policies? Because they don't, on the face of it, seem particularly sustainable.
I do want to mention Sajid David, so I've got my mother's name up, but both we have in the UK very experienced politicians who are of Asian descent, and the rules they've introduced would have actually blocked their own parents from emigrating to the UK. So there's some irony there.
Yes, and the Home Secretary who's in charge of the policy is one of those people.
Yeah. Andrew.
Whose parents fled Idi Amin's Uganda. Yeah. Yes. Again, I mean, it's a tall order, but why should people have to sort of run this insane gauntlet to just put one foot on British territory, after crossing unimaginable sort of horrors and sort of spending their life savings on smugglers just to reach the territory of the UK and then maybe be given a chance at asylum. It must be it must make more sense if especially in the digital age, that these people are allowed to submit asylum claims from outside of the UK and if approved, be able to fly there. And the problem is, resettlement is good. It's a good thing, but of course most people don't benefit from that because you have to actually be near a sort of UNHCR camp and to benefit from it at the moment, and most people cannot and are not. So again, you could talk about, most of the conversations when it comes to cooperation with the French about how to deal with this issue, again, it's all about sort of security. It's all about how to actually just stop these boats coming, and many people try multiple times to get through. It's not like you get stopped once and you give up. These people are constantly trying because that's their ultimate goal. That's their that's their raison d'etre in life. They're not going to stop if they just get caught once. So some of this money might be better used investing in a kind of joint asylum center, perhaps in France. And you do have issues about what to do with the ones that are not given asylum, of course. The French will obviously, that will be their main question. Like, what are we supposed to do with the ones that you decide not to give asylum to? But, again, like that it would make more sense to discuss with the French what to do about that issue rather than come up with insane proposals about offshore processing, which is constantly what you hear getting leaked out of the Home Office about sort of
in countries that really haven't been consulted about it, such as Albania.
No such country. Like, often proposals come out by the British government, leaked to sort of pro-government newspapers, saying this idea that we will stop the flow of boats coming from over the channel by immediately flying these people to, I think the suggestions have been sort of the Falkland Islands, very remote sort of outposts in the Atlantic Ocean, like Ascension Islands, also Albania. And then, I think the Albania proposal has come up 2 or 3 times, and each time it comes up, the Albanian foreign minister has to rebut it and say, we will never do such a thing. Why? Because this is actually going to be an increasing problem. If the rich countries insist on sort of outsourcing their responsibilities and their problems, they'll often find that actually there isn't much incentive for, even if you're a poor country, there's not much incentive for you to be a sort of warehouse of refugees, of sort of, either ones that are being processed or the rejected ones, because at the end of the day, it doesn't look good for your voters to be seen to be cooperating in this manner. There's a big question about what you're going to do with all these people if they're not allowed into say, the UK. It's something that Australia obviously famously has done for a number of years, but famously it's been condemned multiple times as something that's quite barbaric. And
Andrew, can you think of countries that do have more positive policies and environments for refugees, and where something works, where a country where people want to go, where they actually set up a system that works?
I think one problem is, right, that a country like Germany, which obviously is, it's the main economy in Europe, and the more and more people who go there, obviously, the more and more people outside of that country might be encouraged to go because they know people there. This is often how it works. There are countries, though, like Portugal, who receive very few refugees because people simply don't really know it exists, that has in the past been actively promoting itself as a place where people can go and get taught the language, and even including interviews with refugees who have been resettled there, because it's one thing for sort of someone in the UN.
Andrew, and I'm particularly struck. Although the United States has got this great big wall with the South, the United States initially is built on the idea of immigration. The idea is the American dream is that you go to the United States and you become American and you make your fortune. And this seems to be an idea that the United States had fully embraced. Yet it's, I would argue, European countries, Britain, have got a similar prospect for people, yet it's an anathema. It's something we can't accept, and increasingly the US doesn't accept either.
Well, it's a sort of vicious cycle, because if you, for example, sort of think that asylum seekers are, these kind of destitute, sort of threatening people that lie around, well, they're not allowed to work. They get given, I think, something like £30 a week or something, and therefore they sort of become these, sort of desperate-looking people that you might see hanging around with nothing to do on the streets. I'll say another thing actually that just occurred to me. It might be a little bit off topic, but I think the issue of corruption is actually really important, because a lot of countries, for example, in Central America, where people are fleeing from to go to the US, are just completely hollowed out by corruption. They may not, people may not be fleeing, for example, like violence, although many are. They'll be fleeing the fact that like a hospital hasn't been built in about 10 years in their town, because it's all the money has been stolen. And then you have to then follow the money. And where do basically lots of people store their money and launder their money? And this is the West. I mean, London is a classic example. I mean, it's a bit of a tangent, but what's playing out now in Kazakhstan, for example, in part is a protest against the corruption of the regime there. And, it's no different. Where did this regime sort of store their money and buy property? It's London. And I think actually, if you want to address some of the root causes of the push factors in countries around the world, you have to look at the Western complicity in laundering the money that these people steal from their own people, that then forces them as migrants to the West.
Yeah, we've done a discussion on this with the author of Moneyland, Oliver.
Great book. Great book.
Yeah. Nigel Harley, you've got a good follow-up question. Go ahead, Nigel. And we can hear you. You just need to open your microphone and we'll be there. Nigel? Microphone, bottom left hand of the screen. We'll just give you a second, see if you can open it. And if you can't, I will ask your question for you. So Nigel says, how does Andrew see perhaps the most important refugee problem, namely the situation on the US-Mexican border, which if anything has got worse under the Biden administration? The influence of drugs, gangs, and trafficking of these people is enormous. Well, Nigel, you might contest the idea that that's the most important refugee problem, but how would you assess it overall?
Well, I mean, I just sort of preempted that, I suppose, because I do think that, I mean, corruption is a major driver, and I think I said also earlier, a lot of the gang. I mean, really, like some of the sort of level of violence in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador is comparable to a war zone. Can
you give us examples of how that works? I mean, perhaps we haven't really been talking about policy all the time. We really haven't been talking about the sort of human experience of people being trafficked.
I mean, for example, like, if you're sort of just a normal kind of sort of middle class man in an area of Honduras that runs a shop, one day gangs will come and they'll be like, right now you give us 50% of your profits, and if you don't, we'll kill your daughter. I mean, this is a very common occurrence. And what would you do in such a situation? So you have to also, I mean, again, these are very sort of structural and difficult issues. But of course, a lot of this gang warfare that's rampaging across this area. Well, I mean, yes, drugs, and where are the drugs being sold to? Then we get into arguments about a drug policy and so on. But that's one matter. It used to be on the US-Mexico border that a lot of people entering Mexico were Mexicans. And as I understand, the last sort of decade or so, there are much less. And that is in large part because the Mexican economy has actually got a bit better. Because what you can do, obviously, like this is the problem. Sometimes you can give aid. I mean, there is a sort of, sometimes it's misdirected, but there's the idea that you sort of can give aid to these countries and therefore magically people will stay. The irony is that, like, sometimes people might, if they get just enough money, they will leave. So actually, you have to really you have to first of all give a serious amount of money towards, as the Biden administration I think is trying to do to some of these countries, but it has to be directed to, I would say, grassroots organizations, for example, in Central America, that basically enable people to maintain their communities, maintain their family ties, keep people there. And like I say, this kind of encourage circular migration. So the ones that don't have to flee for their lives are able to go to the West, do the jobs that need to be done in aging populations, and then go home and carry on doing this. This will mean that they don't have to give money to dangerous traffickers and arrive in a chaotic, irregular way on the border. I mean, this is something that has been tried and can be done. It's not easy. Some of these countries, for example, like Haiti, are in perpetual crisis, and perpetual sort of natural disasters occur. And this is even before we've got into the issue of climate change.
Yeah. Andrew, we've got a question from Simon Jackson in just a second, but can you just give us an idea of how you actually do your job? Currently, I know you're waiting in Istanbul to go on a Turkish customs boat or a border patrol boat. Just give me a flavour of some of the things you do, because I don't think people realise. I mean, you're very much at the gritty end of things.
I mean, I tend to kind of hang around, well, I don't know, sort of dodgy parts of cities and then borders, because, if you're trying to sort of follow asylum seekers, I mean, the cities is obviously where people first go to get a bit of respite and meet a smuggler. And access whatever services. I mean, it depends. Some people have very long journeys. Some people will go from like Afghanistan to Germany in a matter of maybe a month if they're lucky. But some people, obviously, it takes much longer because they have to work on the way to come up with the funds and so on. But it's very interesting to observe the dynamics on borders. Because a lot of the movement of people cannot be done without the connivance of police forces that are very poorly paid in, for example, the Balkans. I mean, the idea that this number of people can get through what are increasingly now quite militarized borders without the sort of looking the other way or the active participation of police. I mean, this is simply how it works. So I'm quite interested in how the sort of interface between sort of corruption and the armed forces and so on plays out. And so, I mean, often I do, or you can often find people speaking English in a big group of people, but sometimes I do work with, fixers who are from, say, Afghanistan or Syria. They'll be more willing to speak to that kind of person. And then I do a lot of radio and writing. I mean, I don't do really any filming. I find that tends to, help people to kind of open up a bit. So I sort of have a lot of respect for people that do film, because it's the most sort of invasive kind of way about getting information. But I find if you sort of sit down, share a cigarette, and sort of then bring out the microphone in a non-threatening way, you can get people to open up. And, I often just ask people about what they did. I don't necessarily ask them, like, tell me about how the bomb fell on your house. I more kind of say, what did you do before all of this kicked off? And because I think it's actually important to know that these people actually were just living fairly normal, standard lives before whatever broke out in their country.
And is it true to say in many cases to make that journey, you've got to have some money, and your family have got to put up money? So by and large, it's possibly not the poorest of the poor who are doing it, who are actually making that journey.
That's probably sort of by and large true. But what concerns me these days is that, I mean, for example, take Afghanistan. Afghanistan will probably be, one of these famous kind of famines. I think in the same way that Ethiopia was. I hope it won't, but it's looking that way. And so, obviously Afghanistan was always a poor country, and never has it been so poor as now. And so, yes, I mean, I've met people that like, okay, I have also met sort of rich people who had money to fund their trip, who had money to even buy, like documents. But then you've got some people who the whole sort of extended family comes together to sell land, to sell property, and basically invest this in it's effectively a cash cow. You send the son off, from the village in Africa, and that will be the one who first has to pay off the debt and then has to pay back remittances to the family to survive for a long time. And then some smugglers offer a service where you pay on arrival. So you might not pay anything, you know, if you don't have any money for your trip, but you'll pay on arrival. But for me, this effectively means that a whole level of debt bondage takes place. And you see that in the UK. Famously, there was a truck of Vietnamese who were found asphyxiated a couple of years ago. Those were, I guess, going to sort of work in cannabis fields and you know, sort of nail bars and black market work. That sort of may be a trafficking thing from the very beginning, but sometimes you can have smuggling that becomes trafficking. You know, because the smugglers will say, okay, well, we'll pay part of your journey, but you'll work for us at the other end. And I kind of think that kind of thing might
and essentially what you're saying and what you're trying to show is, I mean, we've focused this conversation very much on policy and how you respond to policy, but we've only really spent the last 10 minutes or so talking about the human toll of this, and it's enormous, and your reporting does go into that quite substantially. Andrew, you've got a website as well, which we'll share with people. We're going to have a break now. I'm hoping that you can stay on just for a few minutes afterwards. We've got some people who haven't asked some questions to you. So if you can hold on just for a few minutes afterwards, sure. We'll put more questions to you. But in the meantime, I want to say thank you very much indeed for the last hour. It's been absolutely fascinating, a very valuable conversation. Andrew Connelly, thank you very much indeed.